I stood in my own driveway, staring at 43 years of my life scattered across the lawn like garbage. My late husband's Navy uniform, the one he wore when he proposed to me in 1981, was lying in a puddle near the mailbox. The quilt my grandmother sewed in 1952, the one that had covered every bed in our family for 3 generations, was draped over a bush like a discarded rag. Photo albums from when my children were born, their baby pictures, their first steps, their graduation days, all of it just dumped there like trash waiting for collection. My hands were still trembling, not from age, not from weakness, but from the weight of what I'd just done 3 hours earlier. I'd lowered my baby sister into the ground. I'd watched them close her casket. I'd listened to the priest say words that were supposed to bring comfort, but only brought emptiness. The funeral mass card was still pinned to my coat. Her name, Linda Marie, printed in gold letters that caught the afternoon sun as I stood there trying to understand what I was seeing. That's when I heard her voice behind me, cheerful and light, like she was greeting a neighbor at a barbecue. My daughter-in-law, standing in the doorway of my house, arms crossed, wearing yoga pants that cost more than my weekly grocery budget, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said I was back early, told me not to worry about the mess, that they'd just gotten rid of some old junk, that it was time for a fresh start. I looked at her, really looked at her, and something inside me that had been bending for years finally snapped into place. Not broke, snapped into clarity. I felt something rising in my chest that I hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was colder than that, more focused. It was the absolute certainty that I was done being treated like I was invisible in my own life. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, my fingers steady now, and I looked her dead in the eye. I told her she was right. It was time for a fresh start. Time to throw out what was really useless around here. I watched her smile falter, just for a second, before she caught herself. She had no idea what was coming, because there was something she didn't know, something my son had never bothered to tell her, something that was about to change everything. That house she was standing in so confidently, the one she'd just thrown my entire life out of, it wasn't hers. It wasn't even my son's. It was mine. Every brick, every inch, every corner of that 2-story colonial with the pale blue paint and white shutters. It was still in my name. And what I was about to do with that information? Well, stay with me because this is where it gets interesting. What happened in the next 72 hours didn't just change my life. It exposed secrets that went deeper than I ever imagined. And before it was over, the police would be involved, lawyers would be making emergency calls, and my daughter-in-law would learn a lesson about underestimating a woman who'd spent her whole life fighting for what's hers. Before we go any further into how I took back everything they tried to steal from me, and trust me, you're going to want to hear every detail of what comes next. Let me ask you something. Drop a comment right now and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy true stories like this, real accounts of real people standing up for themselves when everyone expected them to just fade away, be sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what you're about to hear, every single word of it, actually happened. This isn't fiction. This isn't exaggerated for drama. This is the true account of what happens when you push someone too far. And I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll never look at family dynamics the same way again. My name is Margaret Dawson. I'm 64 years old, and I've spent my entire adult life doing what women of my generation were taught to do from the day we were born. Sacrifice. Put yourself last. Make sure everyone else is comfortable, even if it means you're miserable. Smile and keep the peace, even when you're screaming inside. I worked as a night shift custodial manager for 41 years at a medical complex in Hartford, Connecticut. While other people slept in their warm beds, I was scrubbing their floors, cleaning their toilets, emptying their trash, mopping up things I don't even want to describe. Not because I loved it, God knows I didn't love it, but because after my husband Thomas died of a massive heart attack when he was only 42 years old, I had 3 children to feed and no college degree to fall back on. My youngest was only 6 when Thomas died. My oldest was 14. And suddenly I was the only thing standing between them and complete catastrophe. I bought that 2-story colonial house in 2003, with money I'd saved dollar by dollar, shift by shift, overtime hour by overtime hour. Pale blue with white shutters, a small garden in the front where I planted roses every spring, and a workshop in the back that still had Thomas's tools hanging on the wall exactly where he left them. Every single mortgage payment came from me. Alone. Nobody helped. Nobody offered. I did it myself because that's what you do when you're a mother and your children are counting on you. The day I made that final payment in 2018, I sat in my car in the bank parking lot and cried for 20 minutes straight. That house wasn't just a building. It was proof that I'd survived, that I'd won, that despite everything that tried to break me, I was still standing. It represented every sacrifice, every double shift, every birthday party I missed, every school play I couldn't attend because I was working. It was mine. In 2019, when my oldest son David married Jessica, I did what I thought was the generous thing, the loving thing, the thing any good mother would do. I told them they could move in with me while they got on their feet financially. David had just started a new job as a software technician, and Jessica had been working as a receptionist at a dental office, but she kept talking about how expensive rent was, how impossible it was for young couples to save money these days. I understood that. I remembered being young and struggling. So, I added David to the household, gave them the master bedroom, told them we'd be a family under one roof. I moved myself into the smaller bedroom down the hall, the one that used to be David's when he was growing up. And I told myself this was temporary, that they'd save up and move out in a year or two. I kept the deed in my name, though. I specifically told David we'd transfer it officially once they were more established, once they had some savings built up, once I was sure they were stable. That conversation, that very specific conversation about keeping the deed in my name until the right time, he never mentioned it to Jessica. He never told her the house wasn't actually his. And that one detail, that one piece of information he chose to keep to himself, that's what saved my life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, you need to understand exactly how bad things got in that house over the next 3 years. Because what she did to me, what they both allowed to happen, it was worse than just throwing my belongings on the lawn. It was a systematic erasure of my existence, a calculated effort to make me feel so small, so unwelcome, so invisible in the home I'd built with my own hands that I'd eventually just leave on my own. And if I hadn't kept that deed in my name, if I hadn't held on to that one piece of legal power, I would have ended up exactly where they wanted me, with nothing, no home, no dignity, no proof that I'd ever mattered at all. What happened next is going to show you exactly how far some people will go when they think you're powerless, and more importantly, what happens when they realize they were wrong. November 14th, 2022. That's the day everything changed, though I didn't know it yet as I pulled into my driveway at 2:30 inches the afternoon. I'd spent the last 6 months traveling back and forth to Boston, sitting in hospice rooms that smelled like disinfectant and death, watching my baby sister Linda waste away from pancreatic cancer. She was only 61 years old. The doctors said it was aggressive, that there was nothing they could do, that we should make her comfortable. Comfortable. What a ridiculous word to use for someone whose body is eating itself from the inside out. The funeral that morning had been small and cold, the kind where you can hear every sob echoing off the chapel walls, where the silence between prayers feels like it's crushing your chest. There were maybe 30 people there. Linda had outlived most of her friends. I'd given the eulogy because no one else could. My voice breaking as I talked about the sister who taught me to ride a bike, who held my hand at our mother's funeral, who called me every Sunday without fail for 40 years. I came home needing a cup of tea, a quiet room, maybe a hug from my son who I hadn't seen in 2 weeks. I wanted to sit in my kitchen, the one I'd painted yellow because it reminded me of sunshine, and just breathe. Instead, as I turned into the driveway, I saw my entire life spread across the front lawn like a yard sale nobody wanted to attend. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. There was my wedding photo, the one from 1981, where Thomas and I were cutting the cake, in a cracked silver frame lying face down in the grass. David's baby shoes, the tiny white leather ones I'd kept in tissue paper for 33 years, were sitting in a puddle of muddy water near the sidewalk. My husband's Purple Heart medal from Vietnam, the one they gave me at his military funeral, the one I'd kept in a velvet box on my dresser. It was just lying there in the dirt next to a ceramic lawn gnome that Jessica had bought last summer. I got out of my car slowly, my legs shaking, my funeral dress sticking to my back with sweat, even though it was only 50 degrees outside. I walked toward the pile of my belongings like I was in a dream. Like if I moved too fast, everything would disappear and I'd wake up and this would all be some grief-induced hallucination. But it was real. Every item, every memory, every piece of my history was real, and it was outside in the November cold. That's when I heard the front door open, and Jessica's voice, bright and cheerful, like she was greeting a neighbor she hadn't seen in a while, calling out that I was back early, that they didn't expect me until tonight. I turned and saw her standing in the doorway of my house, wearing expensive yoga pants, the kind with the designer logo on the hip that cost $150, and a matching sports bra. Her nails were freshly manicured, pale pink with white tips, and she was holding a coffee mug that said, "Good vibes only" in gold script. I couldn't speak. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. I just stood there holding my purse, still wearing the funeral mass card pinned to my coat, staring at this woman who was smiling at me like she'd just done me a favor. Finally, I managed to ask what all this was, gesturing at the lawn, at my life scattered like trash. Jessica's face lit up like I'd asked about her favorite hobby. She said she knew it looked like a lot, but trust her, this was a good thing. She and David had been watching some Netflix show about minimalism, and they'd realized they were just drowning in clutter, so they'd done a total purge. A total purge. Those were her exact words. She said it like she was describing a juice cleanse or a new workout routine, not the destruction of everything I owned. I bent down and picked up Thomas's wedding photo. The glass cracked right down the middle, cutting through his face. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped it. I asked her, my voice barely above a whisper, how she could throw out my wedding photo. Jessica waved her hand dismissively, that same hand with the fresh manicure, and said, "I'd been widowed for 20 years. Didn't I think it was time to let go?" She said all this stuff about the past wasn't healthy, that her therapist told her holding on to material items keeps us from living in the present. Her therapist, this woman who'd never worked a day since marrying my son, who spent her afternoons getting coffee with friends and posting photos on Instagram, was quoting her therapist at me while my dead husband's photograph sat broken in my hands. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab her by her $300 highlights and drag her through the mud where my memories were lying. But then I saw something that made me stop cold, that made everything else fade into the background. On her left wrist, catching the afternoon light, was a bracelet I recognized immediately. Cartier, the Tank Française model. I knew it because I'd spent 40 years cleaning the office of a jeweler in downtown Hartford, dusting the display cases, polishing the glass, listening to the sales associates explain to customers why this particular piece was worth the investment. Retail price was $7,200. I'd seen women come in with their husbands and spend 20 minutes deliberating over whether to buy it. And here was Jessica, who didn't work, who'd quit her job as a dental receptionist 1 month after marrying David, saying he made enough for both of them, wearing a bracelet that cost more than 3 months of my mortgage payments used to be. Something clicked in my brain right then. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. A question that needed answering. Where did an unemployed woman living in someone else's house get $7,000 for a bracelet? And that question, that single thought, was about to unravel everything. Because once you start pulling one thread, once you start asking questions you should have asked a long time ago, you discover that the lies run deeper than you ever imagined. Stay with me, because what I found out in the next 24 hours about where that money came from, it's going to make what's already happened look like nothing. Jessica didn't give me time to process what I was seeing on the lawn. She immediately launched into talking about my room situation, telling me not to freak out, but they were converting my bedroom into a home office for David. She said he really needed a dedicated workspace, and that room got the best light. I stopped walking. I asked her where exactly I was supposed to sleep. Her voice got even more cheerful, that fake brightness people use when they're about to show you something terrible and want you to think it's a gift. She said they'd set me up in the back, that I should come see, that they'd worked really hard on it. I followed her through my own house, and I barely recognized it. The walls I'd painted sage green were now gray. My comfortable furniture was gone, replaced with sleek modern pieces that looked like they belonged in a magazine spread. The family photos that used to line the hallway were missing, replaced with abstract art that meant nothing. Every trace of me had been removed. She led me to the back of the house and opened a door I knew well. The utility room, 8 feet by 10 feet, where we used to store paint cans and Christmas decorations and old tools, where the water heater hummed and sometimes leaked. She opened that door like she was revealing a prize on a game show. Inside was a fold-out cot, the kind they use in prisons or disaster shelters, with a thin mattress that looked like it had seen better days. There was a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling with a pull string. A lamp without a shade sat on an overturned plastic crate. A space heater that looked like a fire hazard from 1987 was plugged into an extension cord that ran across the concrete floor. There was a cheap area rug, the kind you buy at a dollar store, covering maybe 3 feet of the cold concrete. One small window faced the alley where the garbage trucks came every Tuesday morning. Jessica spread her arms wide like she was presenting a luxury suite. She said it was cozy, that I had my own entrance through the back door, so I wouldn't disturb them when I came and went. She said they were trying to keep the main house as a zen space. A zen space. I stood there looking at this room, this closet they expected me to live in, and my voice came out barely controlled. I told her I'd just buried my sister that morning, that I'd been gone for 6 months taking care of her while she died, and I'd come home to my belongings, thrown on the lawn, and this. Jessica's expression changed then. The fake cheerfulness dropped away and her arms crossed over her chest. Her tone shifted, got colder, sharper. She said she was going to be real with me. She said David and I were building their life here, that they were young, that they were planning for their future. And then she said something I'll never forget. She said honestly, the constant reminders of my past everywhere. My dead husband, my old photos, my outdated furniture. It was all depressing. They needed space that reflected them now, not me from 40 years ago. Me from 40 years ago. Like I was some relic that needed to be stored away. Like my life, my memories, my history in the house I'd bought with my own money didn't matter. That's the moment I saw it clearly, like someone had turned on all the lights in a dark room. This wasn't about minimalism or decluttering or creating a zen space. This was an eviction. A calculated, systematic eviction designed to make me so uncomfortable, so unwelcome, so miserable that I'd leave on my own. They were erasing me. Every photo, every piece of furniture, every reminder that this was my home first. They were pushing me out without having to say the words. But here's what Jessica didn't understand about women like me. Women who'd raised 3 kids alone after being widowed, women who'd worked night shifts for 41 years. Women who'd survived every tragedy life threw at them and still got up the next morning. We don't break. We've been bent so many times we know exactly how much pressure we can take before we snap back. And I was about to snap back so hard she'd never see it coming. I set my purse down very deliberately on that cheap fold-out cot. I looked around that utility room one more time, memorizing every detail. The water stains on the walls, the exposed pipes, the single light bulb, the concrete floor. And I made a decision right there. I was about to rebuild my entire life, starting with throwing out the real junk. And by junk, I didn't mean my wedding photos or my husband's medals. I meant the people who thought they could treat me like I was disposable. What I did next, the phone call I made that night, it set off a chain of events that would expose secrets I never wanted to know. Stay with me, because this is where everything accelerates. That night, I couldn't sleep. The cot smelled like mildew and something else I couldn't identify, maybe old chemicals from the paint cans that used to be stored here. I could hear mice scratching in the walls, their tiny feet scurrying back and forth above my head. The space heater made a clicking sound every few minutes that set my nerves on edge. I lay there in the dark, still in my funeral clothes, because I couldn't bear to dig through the pile on the lawn to find something to sleep in. And I stared at the ceiling. At 1:30 inches the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely. I sat up, turned on the lamp without a shade, and did what I always do when my mind won't quiet down. I organized paperwork. I pulled out my purse and started going through the mail I'd collected from my post office box on the way home from the funeral. Bills, advertisements, credit card offers, and then an envelope I'd forgotten about. My bank statement from First National, the one from my retirement savings account. I opened it without thinking much about it. I'd opened hundreds of these statements over the years, always reassured by the steady balance that represented 41 years of saving every spare dollar. The account I'd linked to David's name as emergency access only when I left to care for Linda in Boston, just in case something happened to me and the kids needed to access funds for my funeral or medical bills. I unfolded the paper and looked at the balance. Then I looked again, because the number didn't make sense. 6 months ago, when I'd last checked before leaving for Boston, there was $83,000 in that account. My entire life savings. Every overtime shift, every birthday where I deposited cash instead of spending it, every tax refund I'd saved instead of splurging. Now the balance read $14,347. I stared at those numbers until they blurred. $68,653. Gone. My hand started trembling so badly the paper fell from my fingers and drifted to the concrete floor. While I was watching my sister die, while I was holding her hand through chemo treatments and cleaning her up when she was too weak to get to the bathroom, while I was planning her funeral and going through her belongings and trying to comfort her children, someone had been draining my life's work. I picked up my phone with shaking hands and opened my banking app, entering my password 3 times before I got it right. I pulled up the transaction history, scrolling back through 6 months of activity. What I saw made my blood run ice cold. This wasn't random withdrawals for emergencies. This was systematic theft. $4,000 at a furniture store, $8,000 at a luxury car dealership, $7,200 at Tiffany & Company, the same amount as that Cartier bracelet on Jessica's wrist. The withdrawals kept going, page after page, and what I realized in that moment was worse than just stolen money. This was planned. This was calculated. And what I was about to uncover about where every single dollar went, it was going to destroy what was left of my family forever. At 6:47 inches the morning, while the sky was still gray and the street was quiet, I slipped out the back entrance of my own house and walked 2 doors down to see the one person I knew saw everything that happened on our street. Doris Kellerman, 72 years old, retired postal worker, widow like me, and the notorious neighborhood watch captain who kept track of every car that didn't belong, every package that sat too long on a porch, every suspicious movement. If anyone knew what had been going on while I was in Boston watching Linda die, it was Doris. I knocked softly on her door, not wanting to wake the whole neighborhood. She opened it within seconds, still in her bathrobe, and the look on her face told me everything I needed to know before she even spoke. She pulled me inside immediately, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman her age, and whispered that she'd been sick about this whole situation, that she was so glad I'd come. We sat at her kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared coffee and gossip for the past 19 years, and she poured me a cup with hands that shook slightly. She told me she hadn't known how to reach me while I was with Linda, that she didn't want to add to my burden when I was dealing with hospice and funeral arrangements, but things had been happening at my house. I asked her what kind of things, though part of me didn't want to know. She said that 3 months ago, in August, she'd seen them loading furniture into a truck. My dining room set, the one with the carved legs, the antique one. My mother's dining set. Cherry wood, hand-carved in 1948 by my grandfather, who'd been a furniture maker in Pennsylvania. I'd had it appraised years ago at $12,000, not that I ever planned to sell it. It was supposed to go to my children, to their children. I asked Doris if they'd sold it, though I already knew the answer. She nodded and said a dealer had come with a truck, that she'd watched Jessica count cash right there on the driveway, had to be at least a couple $1,000s in $100 bills. I whispered, asking what else had happened, and Doris pulled out her phone. She said she'd started documenting, that she hoped I didn't think she was being nosy, but she'd felt like something was wrong, and she wanted me to have proof. She showed me photos she'd taken from her living room window, delivery trucks from expensive furniture stores, a white Lexus in my driveway that I'd never seen before, shopping bags from Neiman Marcus, Restoration Hardware, Williams-Sonoma, piled on the porch. She scrolled through weeks of photos, and each one felt like another punch to the stomach. She said new furniture had been delivered every other week, that she'd seen them unload a Peloton bike, that the kitchen had been completely remodeled, and she'd heard the contractor say the job cost $40,000. Then Doris said something that made my chest tighten. She said my son had no idea what was happening. She saw him leave every morning at 6, come home every night at 9 or later, and he looked exhausted, like he was working himself into the ground. But Jessica was home all day, spending money, accepting deliveries, directing contractors. I felt like I was falling down a well with no bottom. But Doris leaned in closer and said there was one more thing, and this was going to hurt. She slid a printed email across the table. She explained that her daughter works at Hartford County Hall in the records department, and last week Jessica had come in asking about how to transfer property deeds from elderly parents into children's names. Specifically, Jessica had asked about cases where the parent might be declared mentally unfit. My hand tightened around my coffee cup so hard it cracked, hot coffee spilling across the table. She was planning to have me declared incompetent, to take the house legally, to erase me not just from the home, but from the paperwork itself. And what I realized in that moment was that I'd been in a race against time without even knowing it. I left Doris's house and spent the next 4 hours doing what I should have done from the beginning, documenting everything. I went back to that utility room they expected me to live in, and I photographed it from every angle. The mildew creeping up the walls in dark patches. The exposed wiring that hung from the ceiling like something from a condemned building. The lack of proper ventilation, just that one small window that barely opened. I photographed the concrete floor, the space heater with its frayed cord, the cot that sagged in the middle. Then I went outside and photographed every single item they'd thrown on my lawn, my belongings still sitting there like trash 2 days before garbage collection. I made a list as I went, writing down each item with its estimated value. Thomas's navy uniform, $400 to replace. My grandmother's quilt, irreplaceable but worth at least $800. The wedding photo in its silver frame, $300. My mother's jewelry box with the items inside, $2,000. I collected every bank statement from the last 6 months, spreading them across that utility room floor and highlighting every unauthorized withdrawal in yellow marker. $68,653. I could account for almost every penny now, thanks to Doris's photos and what I'd seen with my own eyes. The Cartier bracelet, $7,200. The kitchen remodel, $40,000. The furniture deliveries, the Peloton bike, the Lexus I'd seen in Doris's photos. It was all there, in black and white, a paper trail of theft. Then I drove to my bank and accessed my safety deposit box, pulling out my original property deed. The document that proved beyond any doubt that the house was mine, that David's name had never been added, that Jessica had absolutely no legal claim to anything. I held that deed in my hands and felt something shift inside me. This was my weapon. This was my proof. This was how I was going to take back everything they'd stolen. Then I made a call to someone I hadn't spoken to in 5 years. Kenneth Roth, the attorney who'd handled my husband's estate back in 2002 when Thomas died and left me with 3 kids and a mountain of medical debt. Kenneth was 70 years old now, semi-retired, only taking cases for old clients and friends. But he'd told me once, years ago when he'd finished settling Thomas's affairs, that if I ever needed anything, and he'd emphasized the word anything, I should call him. He'd written his personal cell phone number on the back of his business card and told me to keep it somewhere safe. I'd kept it in my wallet for 23 years. It was time to make that call. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar, saying my full name like he'd been expecting to hear from me. He said he'd heard about Linda, that he was so sorry, calling me sweetheart the way he always did. I thanked him but told him I wasn't calling about Linda. I needed legal help, and I needed it immediately. His tone shifted instantly, became professional and focused, and he told me to tell him everything. I did. I told him about coming home from the funeral to find my belongings on the lawn, about the utility room with its mildew and exposed wiring, about the $68,000 taken from my retirement account, about my mother's dining set being sold for cash in the driveway, about Jessica going to County Hall to ask about declaring elderly parents mentally unfit. When I finished, there was silence on the line for what felt like a full minute. Then I heard something I'd never heard before in all the years I'd known Kenneth Roth. He was laughing, not a polite chuckle, but a genuine, delighted laugh. He said they had no idea what they'd just done, did they? I asked him what he meant. He started asking questions rapid fire. Did I still have the deed in my name? Yes. Had they made unauthorized withdrawals from my account? $68,000 worth. Had they sold my property without consent? My mother's dining set worth $12,000. Kenneth's voice changed again, and I could hear him barely containing what sounded like glee. He told me to listen very carefully. I was not to do anything, not to confront them, not to move my things, not to give them any warning whatsoever. He asked if I could be at his office the next morning at 9. I said yes. He told me good. Because we weren't just getting my house back, we were going to make sure they never forgot who they tried to mess with. I hung up that phone feeling something I hadn't felt in 20 years. Powerful. In control. Like I was the one holding all the cards for once. But I had no idea what Kenneth had already started uncovering. Because when I walked into his office the next morning at exactly 9 o'clock, he had a file on his desk that was at least 2 inches thick. A file he'd compiled in less than 24 hours by calling in favors and accessing records I didn't even know existed. And what was in that file, what he'd discovered about Jessica and about my own son's involvement, it was so much worse than I ever imagined. What I'm about to tell you next, it's going to show you that sometimes the people you trust most are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. Stay with me, because this is where everything I thought I knew about my family gets turned completely upside down. Kenneth Roth's office was exactly as I remembered it from 23 years ago. Rich mahogany furniture, diplomas lining the walls, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal volumes that probably cost more than my car. He was 70 now, his hair completely silver, but he was still sharp in his tailored suit and polished shoes. He gestured for me to sit and asked if I wanted coffee, then told me I was going to want to sit down for what he was about to tell me. I sat in the leather chair across from his desk and noticed immediately the large file folder sitting between us, at least 2 inches thick, with my name written on the tab. Kenneth opened it carefully and said he'd made some calls the night before, called in favors from people he knew in banking and real estate. He said my situation was worse than I described on the phone, but it was also better for me legally. I didn't understand what he meant. He started with the house, explaining that legally I was the sole owner, that my son David had zero claim to the property. David had been living there as my guest, what attorneys call a tenant at will, and I could revoke that permission at any time for any reason. Kenneth slid a document across the desk, my property deed with official stamps and signatures, and he explained we were going to file for immediate eviction based on property destruction and unauthorized subletting. I asked what he meant by unauthorized subletting. Kenneth smiled slightly and explained that Jessica wasn't family in the legal sense, that she wasn't on the deed, that she had no legal relationship to the property whatsoever. Technically, my son had allowed someone else to occupy my home without my written consent, and that was grounds for immediate removal. I felt the first real spark of hope since I'd pulled into my driveway 2 days ago. But Kenneth wasn't finished. He moved on to the money, the $68,000 withdrawn from my retirement account. He'd already pulled the complete transaction records and had them organized in a spreadsheet that showed dates, amounts, and locations. He read them out loud. $4,200 at Tiffany & Company, $8,900 at a BMW dealership, $6,700 at a plastic surgery center in Manhattan, $12,000 to a company called Elite Image Consulting, which he explained was a personal branding and wardrobe service for wealthy clients. None of this was for emergencies. This was systematic, calculated theft. I asked him if we could get the money back, and he said every penny plus damages plus legal fees. He was filing for restitution and asset seizure, meaning if they couldn't pay in cash, we'd take it from whatever they owned. The jewelry, the cars, the new furniture, everything. I should have felt victorious in that moment, but something was bothering me, something I couldn't quite name. I told Kenneth that David was my son, that he wasn't a thief, that he wouldn't do this knowingly. I said I thought Jessica had manipulated him, that she'd been the one making the withdrawals, that David probably didn't even know. Kenneth's expression changed. He interrupted me gently and said he needed to show me something else. He hesitated, his hand hovering over another document in the file, and I could see he didn't want to do what he was about to do. He pulled out email printouts, several pages stapled together, and explained that his investigator had pulled phone records and email metadata linked to our shared family account, the one I'd set up years ago so we could all stay connected. These emails were from David. He slid them across the desk. I picked up the first page and read the words that would change everything. The email was from David to Jessica, dated 3 months earlier while I was still in Boston. It said he'd deposited another $8,000 into her personal account that I would never notice because I didn't check the statements. He told her to use it for whatever she needed. He told her not to mention it when I got back. He said they'd deal with the living situation after the holidays. The living situation. Like I was a problem to be managed. My son, my firstborn, the boy I used to rock to sleep singing "You Are My Sunshine," the child who used to tell me I was his hero. He knew everything. He'd been part of it from the beginning. This wasn't Jessica manipulating an innocent man. This was both of them, together, systematically stealing from me while I watched my sister die. And what Kenneth showed me next, the other emails in that stack, they revealed a plan that was even more calculated than I'd imagined. I stared at that email until the words blurred and silent tears started falling onto Kenneth's expensive mahogany desk. He said gently that he was sorry, that he knew this wasn't easy. I asked him how long this had been going on, my voice breaking on the words. He told me the withdrawals had started 7 months ago, right after I'd left for Boston to care for Linda. 7 months. I did the math in my head. That meant they'd started planning this the moment I walked out the door to go sit with my dying sister. While I was sleeping in hospital chairs that made my back ache, holding Linda's hand through chemo treatments that left her vomiting for hours. They were spending my money on designer handbags and luxury items. While I was planning a funeral and picking out a casket and writing a eulogy that I could barely get through without sobbing, they were remodeling my kitchen with my own money. While I was grieving the last member of my immediate family, they were plotting how to erase me from my own home. I wiped my tears with the back of my hand and felt something hardening inside my chest. I asked Kenneth what my options were, and my voice didn't shake anymore. He laid them out clearly. Full eviction, restitution lawsuit, and if I wanted, criminal charges for elder financial abuse and fraud. I repeated the words, criminal charges, feeling the weight of them. Kenneth nodded and confirmed that yes, criminal charges would mean David could go to jail, possibly for several years, given the amount stolen. I sat there in silence, processing what that would mean. My son, in prison. My grandchildren, if he ever had any, growing up knowing their father was a convicted felon. I told Kenneth I didn't want my son in prison, but I did want justice. He leaned forward and proposed a strategy. We'd file eviction and restitution, give them one chance to settle out of court with a full repayment plan, immediate vacating of the property, and a formal apology. I asked what would happen if they refused. Kenneth leaned back in his chair and said, then we'd file criminal charges and take them for everything they had, that it would be their choice how this played out. I took a deep breath, feeling the oxygen fill my lungs, and I nodded. I told him to do it, to file everything. Kenneth's expression became serious, and he warned me that I needed to be prepared, that when they were served with these papers, it was going to get ugly. I thought I was prepared. I thought after everything I'd already seen and discovered, after finding out my own son had betrayed me, that I knew how bad it could get. I was wrong. Because when the sheriff's deputy showed up at my house 3 days later and handed Jessica that manila envelope with the court documents inside, what she did next shocked everyone who witnessed it. Even the police officers who arrived afterward said they'd never seen anything quite like it. What I'm about to tell you, it's going to show you exactly how dangerous people become when they realize they're about to lose everything. What happened next unfolded so fast, I barely had time to process it. Jessica grabbed a ceramic vase from the entryway table, one of the expensive ones she'd bought with my money, and hurled it against the wall. It shattered into hundreds of pieces, white shards scattering across the hardwood floor. She screamed that if I wanted to destroy her life, then fine, she'd destroy mine. Before David or I could react, she was running through the house, grabbing things, my remaining belongings that hadn't made it to the lawn yet, photo albums I'd hidden in a closet, clothes I'd managed to save. David was yelling at her to stop, but she ignored him completely. She shouted that if I wanted them out, they'd leave, but they were taking everything, that this was compensation for all the emotional abuse I'd put her through. Emotional abuse. The words would have been funny if they weren't so delusional. She ran outside and started throwing items into the driveway, adding to the pile that was still sitting there from 3 days ago. I stood in the doorway with my phone out, recording every single second of her breakdown. I could see neighbors coming out of their houses, standing on their porches, watching this spectacle unfold. Doris was on her phone, and I knew without asking that she was calling the police. I looked at David and told him calmly to control his wife, or I was calling the police myself. He ran after Jessica, pleading with her to stop, telling her she was making everything worse. She spun around on him, her face red and twisted with rage, and screamed that he was the problem, that his mother was the one suing them, that his mother was trying to make them homeless. David shouted back that they'd stolen from me, that they'd sold my mother's furniture, asking what she thought was going to happen. Jessica's voice went even higher, calling him a coward, saying he'd promised her a life, promised her this house, and now he was taking my side. David said there were no sides, that they were wrong, and I could see something breaking in him as he said it. But Jessica wasn't done. Her face changed, the rage transforming into something colder and more calculated. She said fine, if he wanted to know the truth, if he wanted to know the real truth, she'd tell him. The look on her face in that moment, I knew whatever was coming next would be bad. I just had no idea how bad. She said it clearly, loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, that there was no baby. Complete silence fell over the street. David whispered, asking what she meant. Jessica said she wasn't pregnant, that she never had been, that she'd lied about the whole thing. David stumbled backward, like he'd been physically shot. I hadn't known she'd been claiming pregnancy. This was news to me, and based on David's reaction, it seemed like it had been a major part of their plans. He asked about the test, about the doctor's appointments, his voice breaking on every word. Jessica shrugged and said they were fake tests from Amazon, that she'd never been to a doctor, that she'd been going to the spa while he thought she was at medical appointments. David fell to his knees right there in the driveway, and I heard him say they'd been telling people, planning a nursery, that he'd told his work he'd need paternity leave. Jessica said she'd been planning to fake a miscarriage next month, blame the stress from his horrible mother, make him choose between her and me. Then she looked directly at me with pure hatred in her eyes and said congratulations, that I'd won, that I got my house and my precious son back, that she hoped I was happy. She stormed to her car, the white Lexus I'd seen in Doris's photos, and sped away so fast the tires squealed. David remained on the ground sobbing, his whole body shaking. Neighbors were staring from their porches and yards. I was standing in my doorway, phone still recording, and I felt nothing. Not victory, not satisfaction, not even anger anymore. I'd won the battle. I'd exposed the truth. But watching my son fall apart on the driveway of the home I'd bought to protect him and give him a better life, it didn't feel like winning. It felt like devastation, like watching everything I'd built and sacrificed for crumble into dust. That should have been the end of the story. Jessica was gone, the truth was out, and I had my house back. But 2 days later, I got a phone call that changed everything again. Jessica had one more card to play, one final move that almost destroyed everything I'd fought for. And this time, she wasn't just coming after my house or my money. She was coming after my freedom. For 48 hours after Jessica's meltdown, there was complete silence. She disappeared, and nobody seemed to know where she'd gone. David was staying at a cheap motel off Route 9, too ashamed to face me or answer my calls. I'd moved some of my belongings back inside the house, slowly reclaiming spaces that had been taken from me. I was beginning to think the worst was over, that Jessica was gone for good, and now it was just a matter of legal paperwork, and David eventually working up the courage to apologize properly. Then my phone rang at 3:15 on a Wednesday afternoon. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer it, thinking it was a spam call, but something told me to pick up. A woman's voice, professional and businesslike, asked if she was speaking with Margaret Dawson. I confirmed I was. She introduced herself as Kelly Pritchard from Adult Protective Services and said they'd received a very serious complaint regarding my living conditions and mental state. She needed to schedule an emergency wellness check. I felt the room tilt. I asked her to repeat what she'd just said, certain I'd misheard. Kelly explained that they'd received a report from a family member stating that I was living in uninhabitable conditions, suffering from paranoid delusions, and making unfounded accusations of theft against my caretakers. My caretakers. Jessica had reported me to Adult Protective Services, had turned the entire situation around and claimed that I was the one who was incompetent, that I was the one who needed intervention. It was brilliant in a horrifying way. If APS determined I couldn't care for myself, they could assign a guardian, and Jessica would undoubtedly volunteer for that role. She'd get legal control over my finances and property without needing to have me declared mentally unfit through the courts. I told Kelly this was absurd, that I was a 64-year-old woman with full mental capacity, that this was retaliation for a lawsuit. Kelly's voice remained professional but firm. She said she understood this was uncomfortable, but they were required by law to investigate all reports of elder self-neglect and potential exploitation. She could come tomorrow at 10 in the morning, or they could involve law enforcement to ensure my safety. The threat was clear. Either I cooperated or police officers would show up at my door. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I told her tomorrow at 10 would be fine. The moment I hung up, I called Kenneth. He answered, and I told him what had just happened. He said a word I'd never heard him use before, then asked in disbelief if Jessica had really reported me to APS. I confirmed she had, and that they were coming tomorrow. If they determined I was unable to care for myself, Kenneth finished my thought, they could assign a temporary guardian, and Jessica would push to be that guardian, giving her legal control over everything. Kenneth was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him thinking. Then he laid out a plan. He was calling in a favor from Dr. Helena Moss, a geriatric psychiatrist who did capacity evaluations for the court. She'd come assess me that same night and provide documentation that I was fully competent. He was also calling Judge Raymond Chen, who apparently owed him a favor, and we'd get an emergency restraining order preventing Jessica from filing any guardianship petitions. Then he said something that made my heart race. When APS showed up tomorrow, I wasn't going to be in that utility room. I asked where I'd be. He said in the master bedroom. My bedroom, in my house. As of right now, I was moving back in, and if David or Jessica tried to stop me, they'd be arrested for trespassing. At 7 o'clock that night, I walked through the front door of my own home for the first time in 3 days since being served the eviction papers. Not the back entrance like I'd been doing. Not sneaking around like a guest who'd overstayed their welcome. The front door, and what happened in the next 3 hours. It was the moment I truly took my power back and became the woman I should have been all along. Kenneth had arranged for a police officer to accompany us when I moved back into my house. Officer Rodriguez from the Hartford Police Department, just in case David or Jessica showed up and tried to cause problems. The house was empty when we arrived at 7:30 that evening. David was still at the motel, probably afraid to come back, and Jessica was nowhere to be found. But stepping back into that space, walking through rooms that were legally mine but felt completely foreign, everything looked wrong in ways I hadn't fully processed during the chaos of the last few days. They'd painted over my sage green walls, the color I'd chosen because it reminded me of spring, with this cold gray that made every room feel like a waiting area. My comfortable couch, where I'd sat with my children and read them bedtime stories, was gone, replaced with some modern monstrosity that looked like an art installation, all sharp angles and hard surfaces with no warmth whatsoever. My family photos that used to line the hallway, 3 generations of memories in matching frames, were completely gone. In their place were abstract prints, geometric shapes, and random splashes of color that meant absolutely nothing to anyone. They tried to erase me from my own home, remove every trace that I'd ever existed here, that I'd raised a family here, that I'd built a life here. I walked upstairs slowly, Kenneth and Dr. Moss and Officer Rodriguez following behind me, and I stood at the door of the master bedroom. The room I'd shared with my husband Thomas for 18 years before he died. The room where I'd rocked my babies to sleep when they had nightmares or fevers. The room where I'd cried alone for months after becoming a widow. I put my hand on the doorknob and pushed it open. Everything was different. The furniture was all new, expensive-looking pieces that probably came from one of those high-end stores Jessica had been photographed coming out of. Her clothes filled the closet, designer labels and price tags still attached to some items. Her makeup covered the vanity, hundreds of dollars worth of products scattered across the surface. Officer Rodriguez stood beside me and said very clearly that this was my property, that I had every legal right to be here, and if anyone tried to remove me or threaten me, I should call 911 immediately. I told him I understood. Then Dr. Moss, a woman in her mid-60s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor, began conducting her cognitive assessment right there in my bedroom. She asked me to tell her the date. I said November 23rd, 2022. She asked why she was here. I looked her straight in the eye and told her the truth, that my daughter-in-law was trying to have me declared incompetent so she could steal my house after already stealing $68,000 from my retirement account. Dr. Moss made notes on her tablet, and I caught her suppressing a smile. She said, my insight and judgment appeared to be excellent. The evaluation continued for nearly 2 hours. She asked me about my medical history, my daily routines, my ability to manage finances and make decisions. She had me do memory tests, recall lists of words, solve basic math problems, explain how I'd handle various scenarios. 2 hours later, Dr. Moss presented her findings to Kenneth in my kitchen, while I sat in the living room waiting. I could hear parts of their conversation. She said I was sharper than most people half my age, that I had perfect cognitive function with no signs of dementia, delusion, or impaired judgment. In fact, she said I was handling an incredibly difficult situation with remarkable clarity and strength. Kenneth asked if she could have the written evaluation by morning. Dr. Moss said she'd email it within the hour. After everyone left, after Kenneth and Dr. Moss and Officer Rodriguez drove away and I was alone in that house, I went back upstairs to the master bedroom. I moved Jessica's things off the bed, opened the windows to air out the perfume smell she'd left everywhere, and I lay down on my own bed for the first time in 6 months. It should have felt like victory, like reclaiming territory that had been stolen from me. But all I could think about was my son. The boy who used to crawl into this exact bed during thunderstorms, squeezing between Thomas and me and feeling safe. The teenager who'd sit right here on the edge of the mattress and tell me about his dreams of becoming an engineer, of making me proud. The man who'd betrayed me in ways I never imagined possible, who'd stolen from me while I watched my sister die, who'd allowed his wife to treat me like garbage in the home I'd worked 41 years to afford. I wondered if we could ever come back from this, if there was any path forward that didn't involve complete destruction of our relationship. I didn't have answers. The next morning, when Adult Protective Services arrived at exactly 10 o'clock for their wellness check, they weren't alone. Jessica had shown up with her own lawyer, a man in an expensive suit who immediately started making accusations and demands. What happened in that meeting, the things that were said and the evidence that was presented, it ended Jessica's plans permanently. And what came after that? The final confrontation and the choice my son had to make, it changed our family forever. Kelly Pritchard from Adult Protective Services arrived at exactly 10 o'clock the next morning. She was a woman in her 40s, professional and no nonsense, carrying a tablet and a folder thick with paperwork. Kenneth sat beside me at my dining room table, the one Jessica had bought with my money to replace the antique set she'd sold. And then there was Jessica, who I hadn't seen since her meltdown 3 days earlier, sitting across from us with her attorney, a man named Richard Moss, who wore a suit that probably cost $3,000. Kelly thanked everyone for being there and said she'd get right to it, that she needed to ask me questions about my living situation. Before she could continue, Jessica's attorney interrupted and stated for the record that his client had serious concerns about my capacity to maintain the property and manage my finances. He claimed they had evidence of erratic behavior and paranoid accusations. Kenneth didn't miss a beat. He slid a document across the table and explained it was a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation completed the previous night by Dr. Helena Moss, a graduate of Stanford Medical School with 30 years of experience in geriatric psychiatry. Doctor, Moss had found me to be in excellent mental health with full decision-making capacity and zero signs of cognitive impairment. Kelly took the document and read through it carefully, commenting that it was very thorough. Jessica burst out that I'd paid for that doctor, that the whole thing was rigged. Kelly's tone became sharp as she explained that Dr. Moss was a court-approved evaluator and her assessments were legally binding. Then she turned to me and asked me to describe my current living situation. I explained calmly that I was living in my own home, which I'd purchased in 2003, that I'd allowed my son and his wife to stay temporarily, and they'd violated that arrangement by stealing $68,000 from my bank account, selling my property without permission, and attempting to force me into a storage room. Jessica shouted that I was lying, her voice getting shrill and desperate. Kenneth stated calmly that we had bank statements, email records, and video documentation. He pulled out his tablet and played the video I'd recorded on my phone 3 days earlier. Jessica's complete meltdown, throwing the vase, screaming, hurling my belongings around. Kelly watched the entire thing without expression, but I could see her face becoming more serious with each passing second. When it finished, she looked directly at Jessica and said that Jessica had reported I was living in uninhabitable squalor and unable to care for myself, but what Kelly was actually seeing was a woman who was clearly articulate, well-groomed, financially literate, and living in a well-maintained home that I owned. What she wasn't seeing was any evidence of the claims Jessica had made. Jessica tried to argue that I was manipulating everyone, that I was turning people against her. Her own attorney told her quietly to stop talking. Kelly asked me if I felt safe in this home. I told her I did now, that I had a restraining order being filed against my daughter-in-law, and my son was no longer residing here. Kelly closed her tablet with a decisive snap and said she was closing the case. She stated clearly that I was capable of independent living and sound decision-making, and there was no basis for any intervention. Then she turned to Jessica, and her tone went ice cold. She said that filing false reports with Adult Protective Services was a criminal offense, that Jessica had wasted state resources on fraudulent claims, and she was referring this matter to the district attorney's office. Jessica's face went completely white. She stammered that they couldn't do this, that she was just trying to protect herself. Kelly cut her off and said Jessica had been trying to manipulate the system to gain control over someone else's assets, that this was exploitation, the very thing Jessica had falsely accused me of experiencing. Kelly stood up, packed her tablet and folders, and apologized to me for what I'd been through. She said if I needed any resources or support, I shouldn't hesitate to call their office. I thanked her, and she left. The room fell into tense silence. Jessica and her expensive attorney remained seated, and I could see panic setting in on Jessica's face as she realized every plan she'd made had just collapsed. Kenneth leaned back in his chair and said simply that now we needed to talk settlement. What happened in the next 30 minutes, the terms that were laid out, and the choice Jessica had to make, it brought this nightmare to its conclusion. But before we get to that, I need to tell you something. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, you need to do it right now, because stories like this, real accounts of real people fighting back against exploitation and abuse, these are the stories that need to be told. And if you don't subscribe, you're going to miss what happens next, the final confrontation, and how this all ends. Don't be that person who watches until the end and then forgets to subscribe. Do it now. Kenneth spread documents across the dining room table and addressed Jessica's attorney directly, laying out the options. Option 1 required Jessica to agree to full repayment of $68,653 plus interest, bringing the total to $74,000. The payment plan would be $2,000 per month for 3 years. She had to vacate the property immediately, within 72 hours. She had to provide a formal written apology, and there would be no contact with me for a minimum of 2 years. If she agreed and complied with all terms, we wouldn't file criminal charges for elder financial abuse, fraud, and filing false APS reports. Jessica's attorney asked what option 2 entailed. Kenneth explained without emotion that we'd proceed with criminal prosecution, that Jessica would face up to 7 years in prison and a felony record. Plus, we'd sue civilly for damages, emotional distress, and legal fees. We would take everything, her car, her jewelry, any assets in her name, all of it. Jessica sat there silently, tears running down her face, her mascara creating dark streaks. Her attorney asked if they could have a moment to discuss privately. Kenneth nodded. They huddled together, whispering urgently while I sat there watching. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I'd feel, seeing her backed into a corner with no way out. What I felt was tired of fighting, tired of betrayal, tired of watching my family implode and everything I'd built over 41 years of work crumble because of greed and manipulation. But I also felt something else running through me like steel in my spine. I felt clear, resolved, completely unmovable. This was ending today, one way or another, and I was prepared for whatever choice Jessica made. After several minutes of hushed conversation, her attorney turned back to us and said they'd accept option 1. But Jessica wanted to speak to me directly first. Kenneth immediately told me I didn't have to agree to that I could refuse. I looked at Jessica, her face streaked with makeup and tears, and I said it was okay. She looked up at me and asked in a whisper why I was doing this to her. I told her the truth, that I wasn't doing anything to her, that I was protecting myself from what she'd done to me. Jessica said she didn't mean for it to go this far, that she just wanted a nice life, wanted things to be beautiful. I felt no sympathy. I told her she'd wanted beauty built on theft and lies. That wasn't a life. It was a house of cards, and it was always going to fall eventually. She asked me if I'd ever forgive her, and I was silent for a long moment, truly considering the question. Maybe someday, I finally said, but not today. Today I was just protecting what was mine. I told her to sign the papers. Jessica's hands shook as she picked up the pen and signed her name on every page Kenneth indicated, her tears dropping onto the documents and smudging the ink in places. When she finished, her attorney gathered everything, told us they'd be out of the house within the required 72 hours, and they left through my front door without another word. I watched through the window as Jessica got into a car I didn't recognize, probably borrowed since we'd be seizing the Lexus, and drove away. I never saw her again after that afternoon. She made her payments for exactly 8 months before defaulting, and Kenneth had to seize her remaining assets to cover the debt. But she was out of my life permanently. But the story wasn't over yet, because there was still one person I needed to face, one relationship that hung in the balance. My son, David, the man who'd stolen from me, who'd betrayed me, who'd allowed all of this to happen. What happened between us in the weeks and months that followed, whether we could rebuild anything from the wreckage, that's what comes next. 1 year later, in November 2023, a lot had changed. Jessica kept to the payment plan for exactly 4 months before she stopped sending checks. Kenneth seized her car, the white Lexus, her jewelry, including that Cartier bracelet, everything she owned that we could legally take to cover the remaining debt. Last I heard through mutual acquaintances, she'd moved to Florida and started using a different name on social media, reinventing herself as if the past didn't exist. I don't wish her harm, but I don't wish her well either. Honestly, I wish her nothing. She's become irrelevant to my life, a chapter that's closed and doesn't deserve to be reopened. I repainted every room in my house, bringing back the warm colors I'd originally chosen, the sage green and soft yellows that made the space feel like home. I brought my old furniture out of storage, the comfortable pieces that had memories attached to them. I hung my wedding photo with Thomas back over the mantel where it belongs, the glass replaced, the frame polished. This house finally feels like mine again, not just legally, but emotionally. Every corner reflects me now, my history, my choices, my life. But the biggest change over the past year wasn't the house or the furniture or even getting most of my money back. The biggest change was my son. David and I didn't speak for 3 months after everything happened. He filed for divorce from Jessica, moved into a small 1-bedroom apartment across town, and started seeing a therapist twice a week to work through what he'd done and why. Then one day in February, 7 months ago now, he showed up at my door unannounced. He was holding grocery bags, and he told me he'd brought ingredients to make pot roast using my recipe. I didn't know what to say. I just stepped aside and let him in. We didn't talk much that first day. He cooked while I sat at the kitchen counter watching him, and when the food was ready, we ate in near silence. But he kept coming back. Every Sunday at noon, he'd show up with groceries, and we'd cook together. We didn't talk about Jessica or the money or the betrayal. We talked about small things, real things. His new job at a different tech company where he'd taken a position with less pay but better hours. Books he was reading, mostly self-help and books about rebuilding trust. My garden and which bulbs I was planning to plant for spring. His therapy sessions and what he was learning about himself. Slowly, week by week, we started rebuilding something. It's not the same as it was before. There's still hurt between us, still broken trust that may never fully heal. But there's also something new that didn't exist before. Honesty without pretense. Boundaries that are respected. Respect that's earned through actions, not assumed because of blood relation. Last Sunday, David brought over the pot roast ingredients again, and I watched him season the meat exactly the way I'd taught him when he was 12 years old. He asked me to taste it and tell him if he got the seasoning right. I did, and I told him it was perfect. He smiled, a small, genuine smile, and said he'd learned from the best. We ate dinner together in comfortable silence, and when he left, he hugged me at the door. Really hugged me. Not the quick, obligatory embrace from before, but something real. Is our relationship the same as it was before all this happened? No, it never will be. But maybe that's okay. Maybe what we're building now, based on honesty and earned trust and real respect, maybe that's actually better than the illusion we had before. Maybe we're finally building something real, something that can't be destroyed by manipulation or greed because it's founded on truth. And maybe, just maybe, that's what family was supposed to be all along. If you're watching this right now and you see yourself in my story, if someone in your life is making you feel small, taking advantage of your kindness, treating you like you're disposable, I need you to hear this. You are not too old to fight back. You are not selfish for having boundaries. You are not wrong for demanding respect. And you are never, ever obligated to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, even if that someone is family. I spent 64 years being told that keeping the peace was more important than keeping my dignity, that being a good mother meant accepting disrespect, that love meant endless sacrifice, even when it was destroying me from the inside out. I was wrong about all of it. Real love doesn't humiliate you. It doesn't steal from you. It doesn't try to erase you. Real love respects you, protects you, actually sees you as a human being with value. I'm 65 years old now. I live alone in the house I bought with my own hands after 41 years of scrubbing other people's floors. And I have never felt more powerful in my entire life. Not because I destroyed anyone or got revenge or made people suffer, but because I refuse to let anyone destroy me. That's not revenge. That's survival. That's dignity. That's knowing your worth and refusing to accept anything less than what you deserve. So I want you to drop a comment right now and tell me, what would you have done in my situation? Would you have fought back? Or would you have just accepted it and faded away? And if this story touched something in you, if it made you think about your own life and your own boundaries, subscribe to this channel for more true stories about real people who refused to be pushed around, who stood up when everyone expected them to sit down and be quiet. Because our voices matter, our stories matter, and we matter. Remember this one thing. As you go about your day and your life, the people who call you difficult are usually just upset that you stopped being convenient. So stay difficult, stay inconvenient, stay free. Margaret still lives in her home in Connecticut. David has repaid $23,000 of the debt so far and continues making payments every month. Jessica remarried in 2023 to someone she met online. Margaret wishes her well from a distance, which is to say, she doesn't think about her at all anymore. This story was shared with permission. If you or someone you know is experiencing elder financial abuse, please contact the National Center on Elder Abuse. The number is available in the description below. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for believing that people like me, people like you, deserve to be treated with dignity, no matter how old we are or how tired we've become. Never forget your worth.